Let's try it one more time. Shana Tova. I want to tell you about the first time I visited Israel. I was 16 years old, and I went on Poland Seminar Israel pilgrimage, which meant that I went with 65 other 16-year-olds, and that before going to Israel, we spent 9 days in Poland. And I want you to understand for a minute emotionally what that was like. For 9 days, 16-year-old me experienced as close to firsthand as you can the true horror and the depths of depravity that is represented by the camps in Poland. Unbelievable and horrific sights. And at the same time, I was in the hormonal soup that is a group of 65, 16-year-olds. So juggling those two things at the same time was like progressively having a heavier and heavier weight on my shoulders. And when we got to the airport on the last day as we were going to fly to Israel, we're sitting in the Polish airport, and some of my new friends turned and asked me a question I will never forget, because at the time I thought it was absurd. He said, "Are you going to kiss the ground when we get to Israel?" And I said, "No, it's the ground. That's disgusting." And then something happened. I got on the plane, and as I intellectually knew I was leaving this place where our people had experienced such horror and going to this new place, I felt the burden lift a little more as we traveled. And when the plane landed, me and all my friends, we exploded with cheers and applause. And this was, I think, a year before they redid Ben Gurion Airport. So there was no those walkway things. There was a bus that met you. You walked down the stairs and you took a bus to the terminal. And I waited my turn, and I got to the top of the stairs, and I swear to God, I went down those steps, lips first, and I kissed the ground. And that began a lifelong love affair with the state of Israel. It is such a special place. But frankly, since that moment, as is true with most relationships, it has gotten more and more complicated for me as I learn more and more of the truths. And I thought that I would never recapture the sort of special joy of that first moment until some events in the last few weeks, which are allowing me to give a sermon today which just gets to revel in the joy that is the state of Israel. Israel is an impossible place. It is. When I lived there for the year before college, I had a friend from kibbutz, and we were going to go do something, and we had to go to the ATM first. And we go to the ATM, and all the kibbutzniks share one account. That's how the kibbutz worked. And he goes, "Come here, I want to show you something." And he pulls me over, and the screen says, negative 40,000 shekels. And then he presses a button and takes out 800 shekels, and now it says negative 40,800 shekels. And that's how the banking system works, or doesn't, in Israel. I would watch over and over again at bus stops where there would be not a line, but a rugby scrum, as people tried to get on the bus. And one guy would knock over another guy to get on the bus, get his seat. And then that guy who got knocked over hobbles onto the bus because his back hurts because he got knocked over. And the guy who knocked him over, sitting in the seat, looks up and says, "Oh my God, it looks like your back's hurt. Take my seat." Israel is a place where the impossible happens on a daily basis. It is a place where the impossible is possible. And I want to share with you 3 ways in which that is true. Militarily, technologically, and diplomatically. Militarily, there is no question Israel should not exist. 1948 comes along, 1947, that is declared that Jews can have the state partition. Jews cheer, and every Arab nation attacks this nascent state. We should not have won. And yet somehow, at the end of that first war, there was, for the first time since basically the Maccabees, a Jewish state in the Jewish homeland. Not so long later, 1967 comes along. Egypt is lining up its tanks, its warplanes on the border, ready to destroy the still young state. Israel, in a desperate maneuver, attacks and defeats the Air Force and says to the other Arab nations, just don't attack. This is between us and Egypt. And of course they don't listen. They all attack, and in 6 days, Israel not only is still standing, but has territorial control over 3 times its original size. A few years later, 1973, on Yom Kippur, again the Arab nations attacked. Our military is at half strength because it was Yom Kippur. We should have lost that war. By all accounts, we were losing, and somehow, with great military strength and might, the impossible happened again, and we fought back to a stalemate. That's not to mention the modern developments, the drones, the border fences. Iron Dome exists because Israel said, we left Gaza, and Hamas keeps shooting rockets at us. If they keep doing that, we're going to have to invade, so let's invent something that's never existed before. And in just, I think it took 2 years, they made a system that when a rocket is fired, they can figure out where it's going, they can send another rocket to intercept, and that rocket explodes in such a way that the shrapnel won't hit a living person. That's impossible. And yet it exists in Israel, which is a good segue to the technology. Israel has done amazing things. There are people who have never walked that can walk because of Israeli technology. There are people who cannot see who suddenly get to see colors for the first time in their life because of Israeli technology. If you've ever used GPS, Waze comes from Israeli technology. But even more than that, even more than each of the specific things, the culture that exists. That after your military service, you get together with your friends and you said, what's wrong with the world and what could we make to fix it? And then, this is the thing that's so hard for us Americans, I think, to understand. Then, once they figure out what the thing is they want to do, they fail over and over again. It doesn't work over and over again until one day they find something that does work, and suddenly, once again, the world is shifted because of some new thing. The entire technological startup nation process is the idea that the impossible is possible. Diplomatically, I mentioned before the Yom Kippur War, 1973, a day we should have been destroyed. Only 6 years later, 1979, Israel had peace with Egypt and Jordan a year or two after that. Yasser Arafat, a guy who led a group saying our job is to destroy Israel and kill Jews. Somehow, Yitzhak Rabin, a man who fought in the 1948 War for Independence, stood on the lawn of Camp David and shook his hand. Now, of course, we didn't get all the results we were hoping for from that, but even the fact that it happened should have been impossible. And then we get to the last few weeks. Israel has signed a treaty recognizing normalized relations with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. 2 countries who until very recently saw it as their mission to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. Who said there is no way we can ever exist with Jews having sovereignty over Jerusalem and in Israel. And yet right now, setting up trade arrangements, technology sharing, intelligence sharing. And it seems they may only be the tip of the iceberg. Chad, Morocco, and other African nations Serbia and Kosovo, all on their way in the process of the same thing, normalized relations. A month ago, I would have told you getting a country like UAE to admit Israel exists would have been a miracle. And today, the impossible is possible. We, as a Jewish people, constantly find ourselves at the sea. The Egyptians are coming behind us, and the impassable sea is in front of us. Over and over again, we find ourselves there. The Jewish state is also a testament that sometimes the Jewish story also means that the sea can split. It is not an accident that Theodor Herzl's famous phrase that began the modern quest for a modern state of Israel is Im tirtzu ein zo agada. If you will it, it is no dream. We live in a world where we feel so often bounded by terrible impossibilities. And the Jewish state, Israel, it's got lots of problems and complications, lots of things that we should continue to discuss and demand better from her. But at its core, it represents that truth, that the impossible, if it is good and just, is possible. Shana Tova.